My stepson evicted me from the bakery I built for 30 years before my husband was even in the ground. He told me I was obsolete, that a machine could replace my hands. He thought he had stolen my empire, but he forgot to check the fridge. While he was busy measuring his new office, I walked out with the only thing that mattered: a 100-year-old jar of yeast. I left him with a decoy that would cost him millions. He wanted a war? He just started one. The rain that afternoon felt less like water and more like a cold, heavy hand pressing down on my shoulder. But I refused to shudder or hunch over, because a woman of my age knows that showing physical weakness is like bleeding in a tank full of sharks. I stood there by the open grave and watched the mahogany casket descend into the wet Virginia earth. And I tried to remember the smell of Robert's cologne or the sound of his laugh. But all I could smell was the overpowering scent of damp lilies and wet wool from the crowd of mourners behind me. I had been married to Robert for 30 years, and we had built a life that smelled of yeast and caramelized sugar and vanilla bean, because together we had turned a crumbling brick storefront into the Gilded Crumb, which was the most respected bakery in the city. I was the hands that kneaded the dough, and he was the smile that greeted the customers. But now he was gone, and I was standing alone in the rain, or at least I thought I was alone, until I saw the polished black shoes stepping through the mud toward me. It was Derek, and even at his father's funeral, he looked like he was late for a board meeting. Derek was Robert's son from his first marriage, and he was a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and profit margins rather than people and passion. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and stood next to me, but he didn't put an arm around me, or offer a handkerchief, or say a word of comfort. Instead, he checked his watch and tapped the face of it as if grief had a time limit that I was currently exceeding. "Alara, we need to talk about the logistics," he said, and his voice was dry and devoid of any emotion, and it cut through the sound of the falling rain like a serrated knife. I turned to look at him, and I saw that his eyes were dry and clear, and focused entirely on me, and there was a hunger in them that made my stomach turn. I told him that now was not the time, because we had not even thrown the dirt onto the casket yet. But Derek shook his head and reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't pull out a prayer card or a photo of his father. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and shoved it into my hands, and the paper felt rough and cold against my numb fingers. I asked him what this was, and he smiled a tight, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes and told me that it was the future. Inside the envelope were legal documents and eviction notices and transfer of ownership forms, and as I scanned the dense legal jargon, my heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Derek told me that under the terms of the family trust, which he now controlled as the primary executor, he was exercising his right to assume full management of the Gilded Crumb, effective immediately. I stared at him, and the rain blurred the ink on the page, and I told him that he couldn't do this because I was the head baker, and I was the one who created the recipes, and I was the soul of that place. Derek actually laughed, and it was a short barking sound that made several mourners turn their heads. He told me that I was tired, and I was old, and I was obsolete. He said that baking was a science and a business, and it didn't need a 68-year-old woman fussing over dough like a grandmother. He stepped closer to me, and his voice dropped to a whisper that was meant only for me, and he said that he had already made arrangements for me. He said he had found a very sensible condo in a retirement community across town, and he would pay the first 6 months of rent so I could go there and knit or watch television or whatever it is women my age do while the adults handle the real business. I looked down at the grave where my husband lay, and then back at the son who was stripping me of my livelihood before the funeral service had even ended. The grief I felt began to harden into something cold and sharp in my chest. I didn't scream and I didn't cry, because that is what he expected me to do. I simply folded the damp envelope and placed it in my purse and looked him in the eye. I asked him if he really thought he could run a bakery without knowing the difference between baking powder and baking soda. Derek buttoned his jacket and turned to walk away and threw a final comment over his shoulder. He said that anyone can follow a recipe, Alara, and that I shouldn't flatter myself because I was just the labor and he was the vision. I watched him walk toward his luxury car, and I realized that the rain had stopped, but the storm was just beginning. I parked my old sedan in the alley behind the bakery, and for a moment, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, because I knew that once I stepped out of the car, nothing would ever be the same again. The back door of the Gilded Crumb was usually propped open to let the heat escape, and it would smell of toasted hazelnuts and rising dough. But today, the air was choked with the acrid scent of drywall dust and aggressive chemical solvents. I stepped through the threshold, and the sound hit me before the sight did, and it was the screech of metal tearing against metal, followed by the heavy thud of sledgehammers destroying the work of a lifetime. The bakery kitchen had been my sanctuary for 30 years, a place of warmth and rhythm where the flour settled like snow on the countertops, but now it looked like a war zone. There were men in neon vests swarming over my kitchen like termites, and they were ripping out the vintage maple workstations that Robert and I had sanded by hand. In the center of the room, I saw the most heartbreaking sight of all, which was 2 men taking heavy iron crowbars to the face of the brick hearth oven. That oven had been imported from Italy in 1985, and it held heat like a living thing and imparted a crust to the bread that no machine could ever replicate. Derek was standing in the middle of the chaos, wearing a pristine yellow hard hat that looked ridiculous with his Italian suit, and he was shouting orders over the noise of a circular saw. He saw me standing there, clutching my purse, and he didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. He walked over to me, stepping over a pile of shattered brick that used to be the heart of my business, and he told me that I should not be back here because it was a construction zone and an insurance liability. I pointed a trembling finger at the ruined oven and asked him how he could destroy the very thing that made our bread famous. But Derek just rolled his eyes and tapped the clipboard he was holding. He told me that the brick oven was inefficient and took up too much square footage and required skilled labor to operate, which was a bad business model. He pointed to a large crate in the corner and said that the new convection ovens were fully automated and could bake 3 times the volume with half the staff. He called it progress, but I called it murder. I realized then that arguing with Derek was like trying to explain the color blue to a man who had been blind since birth, because he simply lacked the capacity to understand what I was saying. I told him that I was only here to collect my personal effects, and he waved his hand dismissively and told me to make it quick because the demolition crew was on a tight schedule. I walked over to the corner of the kitchen where the industrial refrigerator stood, and I was relieved to see they were still plugged in. I opened the heavy steel door, and the cold air rushed out to meet me, and there on the bottom shelf sat a simple glass jar covered with a breathable linen cloth. To anyone else, it looked like a jar of bubbling beige paste, but to me, it was more valuable than gold. This was the mother dough, the wild yeast starter that my grandmother had begun over 100 years ago in a small village in France. It was a living organism, a colony of wild yeast and bacteria that gave our sourdough its complex, tangy flavor and its open, airy texture. It was the soul of the bakery, and it was alive. I reached in and cradled the jar in my arms, and as I turned around, I saw Derek watching me with a sneer on his face. He asked me what I was doing with that jar of old slop, and he told me that I should throw it out because he had ordered 50 pounds of commercial instant yeast that was shelf-stable and predictable. He said he didn't want any inconsistent bacterial cultures in his new sterile kitchen. I held the jar tighter against my chest and felt the warmth of the glass, and I told him that he was right, and that he shouldn't worry about this old slop because I was taking it with me to save him the trouble of throwing it out. I grabbed my roll of carbon steel knives and my favorite wooden rolling pin, and I put them all into a canvas tote bag along with the jar. I walked toward the exit and stopped one last time to look at the destruction. Derek shouted that he expected the recipe binder on his desk by tomorrow morning. I didn't turn back. I just walked out into the alley, and the silence of the car felt heavy. I looked at the jar in the passenger seat and whispered that we were going to be okay. Derek had the building and the name, but I had the soul. The week leading up to the grand reopening of the bakery was a blur of packing boxes and the suffocating feeling of being erased from my own life, because Derek was not content with just taking the business. He wanted to scrub my presence from every corner of the city. He had sent a courier to my house every morning with legal threats demanding that I turn over all intellectual property associated with the Gilded Crumb, which was his fancy way of asking for my recipe binder. That binder was a thick, leather-bound volume that I had bought in Paris 40 years ago, and its pages were yellowed with age and stiff with splashes of butter and dusting of cocoa powder. It contained the precise ratios for my almond croissants, and the timing for the brioche, and the temperature adjustments for the sourdough, depending on the humidity of the air. It was not just a cookbook. It was a diary of my life's work. And Derek wanted it simply because he thought it was the instruction manual for printing money. I sat at my kitchen table with the binder open in front of me and a pen in my hand, and I stared at the page for the signature rustic loaf. I knew that Derek had replaced my stone hearth ovens with industrial convection fans that dried out the air, and I knew he had replaced my premium organic flour with bleached commercial grain. I realized then that I didn't need to change a single number on these pages to ensure his failure, because the recipes were designed for quality ingredients and a baker with a soul, neither of which Derek possessed. I closed the binder and felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, because I wasn't giving him the secret to my success. I was giving him a map to a treasure that he didn't have the tools to dig up. When Derek arrived at my front door an hour later, he didn't even knock. He just rang the doorbell repeatedly until I opened it. He was wearing a Bluetooth headset and tapped his foot impatiently on my welcome mat while looking past me into the hallway as if checking to make sure I wasn't hiding any other assets. I handed him the heavy book, and he took it with a grunt and flipped through the pages with a look of distaste on his face, as if the stains of hard work were unsanitary. He asked me if this was everything and if there were any digital copies, and I told him that I was an old woman who didn't trust computers, which made him smirk in that condescending way of his. He told me that he would have his assistant transcribe everything into a database and then toss this dusty old thing in the trash. He turned to leave without a thank you or a goodbye, but paused at the bottom of the steps to tell me that I should come to the opening on Friday just to see how a real business is run. He said he was going to turn the Gilded Crumb into a national brand, and that I would regret not being part of his vision. I watched him drive away and whispered that vision without insight is just a hallucination. The next day, I moved into the condo Derek had rented for me, and it was a soulless box of beige carpet and white walls that smelled of fresh paint and loneliness. The kitchen was a kitchenette with an electric stove that probably couldn't even boil water properly and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly. I unpacked my few boxes and placed the photo of Robert on the nightstand. But the silence of the room was deafening because for 30 years my life had been filled with the noise of mixers and timers and customers laughing. I felt a sudden wave of despair threatening to pull me under, so I went to the small canvas tote bag I had brought with me and pulled out the glass jar. I set it on the laminate counter and removed the cloth cover. The starter was bubbling gently, and it smelled sharp and tangy like vinegar and apples and life. I fed it a cup of flour and a cup of water and stirred it with a wooden spoon, and the rhythmic motion calmed my nerves. This jar contained the wild yeast that lived in the air of my old kitchen and the bacteria that had thrived on my hands for decades. It was the biological fingerprint of my legacy, and Derek thought he could replicate it with a packet of dried granules from a factory. I watched the dough rise and fall in the jar like a living lung, and I knew that while Derek had the name and the building, he was missing the heart. The grand opening was in 2 days, and I decided that I would accept his invitation because I wanted a front row seat when he realized that you cannot bake a masterpiece with a calculator. The morning of the grand reopening arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate, and I dressed with the meticulous care of a soldier going into battle because I wanted Derek to see that although he had taken my business, he had not taken my dignity. I wore my best navy suit and a silk scarf, and I drove to the bakery, which now bore a sleek silver sign that looked more appropriate for a tech startup than a place where people bought their daily bread. When I stepped inside, the sensory shock was immediate and unpleasant because the warm smell of toasted flour and yeast was gone and replaced by the chemical scent of floor wax and the bitter aroma of burnt espresso beans. The interior had been stripped of its cozy charm and was now a blinding expanse of white subway tiles and stainless steel surfaces and uncomfortable metal stools that discouraged anyone from lingering too long. There was loud electronic music thumping from invisible speakers, which forced the customers to shout their orders and destroyed any sense of community or conversation. I stood in the back near the condiment station and watched the line of customers that snaked out the door, and for a moment I felt a pang of jealousy because Derek had certainly succeeded in generating hype. He was standing behind the counter wearing a pristine white chef's coat that he had never earned, and he was grinning and shaking hands and acting the part of the benevolent artisan. But then I looked at the faces of the people as they took their first bites, and the jealousy evaporated instantly to be replaced by a grim satisfaction. I saw Mrs. Gable, who had been buying my rye bread for 20 years, take a bite of a croissant, and her face crumpled in confusion. She pulled the pastry apart, and I could see from across the room that it shattered into dry flakes instead of pulling apart in buttery elastic layers. It was dry and brittle because Derek's new convection ovens blew hot air around so violently that they dehydrated the dough before the butter had a chance to steam and create the layers. I walked up to the display case and bought a simple baguette, and the cashier was a young teenager who looked bored and didn't know the difference between a baguette and a batard. I took the bread to a small metal table and broke it open, and there was no crackle of the crust, only a dull thud. The inside was white and tight like a kitchen sponge, with none of the large irregular air pockets that indicate a long, slow fermentation. I took a small bite and chewed, and it tasted like nothing. It tasted like raw starch and instant yeast and the metallic tang of the cheap baking sheets. It lacked the subtle sourness and the complex nutty flavor that comes from the mother dough and thyme. It was bread that filled the stomach but starved the soul. I wasn't the only one who noticed because the murmurs of discontent were spreading through the room like a contagion. People were leaving half-eaten pastries on the tables and whispering that it wasn't the same and that the magic was gone. Derek noticed the shift in the atmosphere, and his smile began to falter, and his eyes started darting around the room until they landed on me. He stormed over to my table and grabbed my arm with a grip that was too tight and hissed at me to come to the back office immediately. He dragged me through the kitchen, which was filled with harried staff who were just pushing buttons on machines rather than touching the dough, and he slammed the office door behind us. He was sweating, and his face was flushed with anger, and he threw a heavy ledger onto the desk and accused me of sabotage. He screamed that I had given him fake recipes because the croissants were falling flat and the sourdough tasted like cardboard and the customers were complaining. He asked me what I had left out, and he demanded the real numbers. I sat calmly in the chair that used to be mine, and I looked at him with pity because he genuinely didn't understand what was happening. I told him that I had given him the exact recipes down to the gram. I told him that the flour and the water and the salt were the same, but he had changed the variables that mattered. I explained that bread is a living thing, and you cannot rush it with chemicals and high-speed fans, and you cannot replace 30 years of intuition with a digital timer. He didn't want to hear it, and he paced around the small room and told me that I was jealous and that he would figure it out without me. He said he had hired a consultant who would optimize the workflow and fix my broken recipes. He pointed a finger at my face and told me to get out and take my negative energy with me. I stood up and brushed the crumbs of his terrible bread from my lap and told him that he could optimize the workflow all he wanted, but he couldn't optimize flavor. I walked out of the office and through the kitchen, where the staff looked miserable, and out into the dining room, where the crowd had already thinned significantly. I left the Gilded Crumb with a spring in my step because I knew that the rot had already set in and no amount of fresh paint could hide the taste of failure. The decline of a business is usually a slow and painful process, like a loaf of bread going stale sitting on a counter. But under Derek's management, the Gilded Crumb was rotting at an accelerated speed. 2 weeks had passed since the disastrous grand opening, and I didn't need to step foot inside the shop to know that the ship was sinking, because the evidence was everywhere. I read the online reviews from the safety of my condo, and they were brutal and honest in the way that only anonymous internet comments can be. People complained that the sourdough was dense and gummy, and that the croissants tasted like grocery store pastries, and that the service was chaotic and rude. I watched from across the street one Tuesday morning and saw that the line that used to wrap around the block was gone, replaced by a few confused tourists who wandered in and walked out empty-handed. I saw the help wanted sign taped to the glass door, which meant that Derek was already churning through staff because he treated people like replaceable parts in a machine. It gave me no pleasure to see my life's work crumbling, but it gave me a fierce sense of validation to know that my absence was felt so keenly. I had arranged to meet Marcus at a small diner on the edge of town, away from the prying eyes of the culinary scene, because Marcus was not just my flour supplier. He was one of the few people left in this city who remembered me before I was the owner of a bakery. He was sitting in a booth with 2 mugs of black coffee and a folder thick with papers, and he looked like a man who was carrying a heavy burden. Marcus ran the local mill that ground organic winter wheat, specifically for my specifications, and he took as much pride in his grain as I did in my bread. I sat down, and he slid the folder across the table to me without a word, and his eyes were sad behind his wire-rimmed glasses. I opened the folder and saw copies of canceled invoices and new purchase orders that made my blood run cold. Marcus told me that Derek had called him 3 days after the opening and demanded a 20% reduction in price across the board. Marcus had tried to explain that the margins on organic grain were already razor-thin, but Derek had cut him off and told him that flour was just flour and he could get it cheaper from a bulk restaurant supply depot. I looked at the new supplier listed on the invoice, and I let out a bitter laugh because I knew exactly what that stuff was. It was bleached white flour that had been stripped of all its nutrients and treated with chlorine gas to make it age faster. It had no protein structure and no flavor, and it was the culinary equivalent of sawdust. Marcus told me it got worse, and he flipped to the next page, which showed that Derek had canceled the standing order for the high-fat European butter that gave our croissants their golden shatter. He had replaced it with a hydrogenated vegetable oil blend that was technically margarine but legally allowed to be called a spread. I felt a physical pain in my chest because this wasn't just cost-cutting, this was vandalism. I explained to Marcus that this was why the bread was failing, because baking is nothing but chemistry and physics. The protein in the flour forms the gluten network that traps the carbon dioxide, and if you use weak flour, the network collapses and you get a brick instead of a loaf. If you use margarine instead of butter, the water content is too high and it steams the dough from the inside, turning it into a soggy mess instead of creating those beautiful flaky layers. Derek was trying to cheat the laws of nature, and he was blaming the staff for the results. Marcus told me that he had heard from the delivery drivers that Derek was screaming at the bakers every morning, accusing them of incompetence and firing anyone who dared to question his methods. He was cycling through cheap, inexperienced labor, trying to find someone who could perform a miracle with garbage ingredients. I closed the folder and took a sip of the coffee, which was bitter and burnt, but still better than anything Derek was serving. Marcus asked me if I was going to intervene, if I was going to go down there and save the bakery before it was completely destroyed. I looked at my old friend and shook my head slowly because I knew that Derek had to hit the bottom before he would ever look up. I told Marcus that you cannot save a man who is convinced he knows how to swim while he is tying weights to his own ankles. I said that we had to wait because the chemistry of failure was already in motion and the reaction had to run its course. Derek had made his bed with cheap flour and fake butter, and now he had to lie in it. The alarm on my phone woke me at 4 a.m, not because I had anywhere to be, but because my body was still set to the rhythm of the bakery, and old habits are harder to break than bones. In the silence of that generic condo kitchen, I walked over to the counter where the glass jar sat like a shrine, and I lifted the linen cloth to check on the only living thing that truly mattered in this mess. The starter was active and bubbly, and it had risen to the red rubber band I had placed around the jar the night before, which meant it was hungry and ready to work. I leaned in close and inhaled the scent, and it was complex and heady smelling of overripe apples and white wine, and that sharp, acidic tang that tickles the back of the throat. This culture was not just a mixture of flour and water. It was a biological archive of my family history, because it contained wild yeast strains that my grandmother had captured from the air in a small village in Lyon a century ago. It had survived 2 world wars and a transatlantic crossing, and 30 years of business in Virginia, and now it was surviving my stepson's stupidity. Derek believed that he had forced me out with everything intact, but he didn't realize that I had committed the perfect theft right under his arrogant nose. On that last day, while he was screaming about efficiency, I had taken the real mother dough and replaced it with a decoy jar filled with a slurry of cheap flour and a packet of rapid rise commercial yeast from the supermarket. That decoy looked the same, and it bubbled the same for the first few hours, but it had no soul and no depth. It was a sprinter, whereas my mother dough was a marathon runner. The commercial yeast would spike the dough quickly, causing it to rise too fast and collapse in the oven, creating that gummy texture and hollow flavor that the customers were currently complaining about. Derek was out there trying to bake artisan sourdough with a culture that had the complexity of a wet paper towel. I decided that I needed to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my touch, so I took a portion of the starter and mixed it with the premium flour Marcus had given me. I didn't have my massive mixer or my steam-injected hearth oven. I only had a plastic bowl and these old arthritic hands and a residential electric oven that probably had hot spots. But I had the mother and I had the technique. I spent the morning folding the dough gently every 30 minutes, feeling the gluten network strengthening under my fingers like a muscle. It was a meditative process, a silent conversation between the baker and the grain. When the dough was ready, I shaped it into a round boule and slashed the top with a razor blade to let it expand. I baked it in a cast-iron Dutch oven to trap the steam, and when I pulled the lid off 40 minutes later, the smell filled the small apartment, and it smelled like victory. The crust was a deep burnished chestnut color, and it crackled and sang as it cooled, which is the sound of the steam escaping from the crisp shell. I sliced into it, and the crumb was open and pearly and translucent. I took a bite, And the flavor was there, that signature tang that hit the sides of the tongue, followed by the creamy sweetness of the wheat. It was perfect. It was the gilded crumb on a plate. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bakery's social media page, and I saw a video that Derek had posted in a desperate attempt at damage control. He was standing in front of the new ovens looking tired and frantic, and he was explaining that they were experiencing technical calibration issues with the humidity sensors. He was blaming the machines again. He claimed that once the technicians recalibrated the sensors, the bread would be back to its award-winning standard. I watched him lie to the camera, and I almost felt sorry for him because he was looking for a mechanical solution to a biological problem. He could calibrate those sensors until the end of time, but he would never get this flavor because the flavor was sitting here on my counter in a glass jar, eating flour and water. He thought the secret recipe was a list of ingredients in a binder, but the real recipe was the microbial colony that I had nurtured for decades. He was trying to conduct a symphony, but he had fired the orchestra and replaced them with synthesizers, and he couldn't understand why the music felt hollow. I finished my slice of bread and wiped the crumbs from my mouth, and I realized that I held the keys to the kingdom. As long as I had the mother dough, Derek was just a man renting an empty shell. The knock on my door came late on a rainy Tuesday evening, and it was a frantic staccato rhythm that sounded less like a visitor and more like someone trying to escape a fire. I was sitting in my armchair knitting a scarf that I didn't need and listening to the rain drum against the window pane. But I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that door, because desperation has a very specific sound. I opened the door to find Derek standing on the welcome mat, and he looked like a man who had been slowly unraveling for weeks. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. He was holding a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of grocery store flowers in the other, and the sight was so pathetically transparent that I almost laughed in his face. He pushed his way inside before I could invite him, and he started talking immediately, filling the small room with a nervous energy that made the air feel thin. He placed the wine and flowers on the counter and told me that he had come to bury the hatchet because family is the most important thing, and we shouldn't let business get in the way of our relationship. I stood there with my arms crossed and waited for the sales pitch because I knew that Derek never gave anything away for free, not even an apology. He paced around my small living room and finally dropped the act. He told me that he had an opportunity that would change everything. He had been in talks with a massive conglomerate called Global Foods, which was a company that owned half the supermarket brands in the country. They wanted to buy the Gilded Crumb brand and turn it into a national franchise chain. Derek's eyes lit up as he described it, and he talked about frozen artisan loaves in every grocery store freezer aisle in America and cafe locations in every airport and shopping mall. He talked about millions of dollars in licensing fees and stock options, and he looked at me as if I should be impressed that he was planning to prostitute my life's work to a corporation that made cheese in a laboratory. I asked him quietly what any of this had to do with me, since he had made it very clear that I was obsolete. Derek stopped pacing and looked at his shoes, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He admitted that the deal was in the final stages of due diligence, and the board of directors from Global Foods was flying in tomorrow morning for a final site visit and a tasting. They wanted to taste the signature sourdough and the classic croissant before they signed the check. I let the silence hang in the room for a long moment, and I watched him squirm. I asked him why that was a problem since he had his new high-tech ovens and his optimized workflow and his shelf-stable yeast. Derek wiped sweat from his forehead and muttered that the current staff were incompetent and they just couldn't get the product dialed in correctly. He said the bread was inconsistent and the crust wasn't right, and he couldn't risk the deal of a lifetime on a bunch of minimum wage workers. He took a step toward me, and his voice took on a wheedling, pleading tone. He asked me to come back for just one day. He wanted me to come in tonight and bake one perfect batch for the investors. He said that if I did this for him, the company would be sold, and he would be rich, and he would make sure I was taken care of. He promised to cut me a check for my time. I looked at this man who had evicted me from my own kitchen and insulted my craft, and now he was standing in my living room begging me to save him from his own incompetence. I knew that if I refused, the deal would fall through and he would fail, which is what I wanted. But then, a thought occurred to me, a sharp and dangerous thought that made my heart beat a little faster. If he sold the company, he would have the money, but he would also have legal obligations. If the investors bought the company based on a lie, that lie would eventually come to light. I realized that helping him succeed in this moment might actually be the key to his ultimate destruction, because the higher he climbed, the harder the fall would be. I looked him in the eye and told him that I would do it. I told him that I would come in tonight and bake the bread for the meeting, but I had one condition. I told him that I wasn't interested in his money or his charity. I told him that I wanted him to sign a document admitting that I was the founder of the bakery and the creator of the recipes. I told him it was just for my own peace of mind and my legacy, so that history would remember who built the walls he was selling. Derek didn't even hesitate. He was so desperate to close the deal that he would have signed a confession to a murder. He pulled a pen from his pocket and asked where the paper was. I smiled and told him to wait while I got my coat. I was going back to the bakery, and I was bringing the mother dough with me. We arrived at the bakery just after midnight, and the rain had turned into a thick mist that clung to the streetlights like ghosts. I unlocked the back door with the key that Derek had never bothered to ask for back, and we stepped into the silence of the kitchen. It was cold inside, darker and quieter than a bakery should ever be, because the hum of the proofing boxes was gone, and the ovens were cold metal tombs. Derek was vibrating with nervous energy, and he immediately started turning on lights and flipping switches and checking his watch, as if he could speed up the fermentation process by sheer force of will. He told me that the investors would be here at 8 a.m. sharp, and that we needed 3 dozen croissants and 20 loaves of the signature sourdough ready for display. He was pacing back and forth, muttering about profit margins and stock prices and how this deal was going to put him on the cover of business magazines. I placed my canvas bag on the stainless steel work table, and I didn't take out my apron yet. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded document that consisted of 3 pages of dense, single-spaced text. I had prepared this document weeks ago with my lawyer during those first few days of shock when I was trying to figure out how to protect myself, but I had never had the leverage to use it until now. I smoothed the paper out on the metal table and laid a pen on top of it. I told Derek that before I touched a single grain of flour, he needed to sign this. I explained that it was a formal acknowledgement of my role as the founder and creator of the Gilded Crumb brand, and that it also clarified the division of assets regarding the equipment and the intellectual property. Derek looked at the paper with annoyance and asked if we really had to do this right now. He said he didn't have time to read a biography and that we needed to get baking. I crossed my arms and stood still and told him that I had plenty of time and that I was happy to walk out the door and go back to bed. I told him he could explain to the investors why the bakery smelled like bleach instead of bread. He let out a frustrated groan and grabbed the pen. He didn't read a single line. He didn't check the clauses on page 2 regarding the lien on the machinery or the clause on page 3 regarding the ownership of the physical assets in the event of bankruptcy. He just flipped to the last page and scribbled his signature with a heavy, angry hand. He threw the pen down and asked if I was happy now. I picked up the document and checked the signature, and I felt a cold calm settle over me. I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my purse and told him that I was very happy. I told him to get out of my kitchen. Derek blinked and asked what I meant. I told him that I worked alone and that his nervous energy was going to ruin the rise of the dough. I told him to go to his office or go home and sleep, but that he needed to leave me and the yeast to do our work. He hesitated for a moment, but he knew he had no choice, so he grabbed his jacket and retreated to the front office, closing the door behind him. The moment he was gone, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I walked over to the new industrial mixer and wiped it down with a damp cloth, trying to bond with this cold machine. Then I opened my canvas bag and took out the jar. I removed the lid, and the smell of the mother dough filled the space immediately. It was sharp and pungent and alive. I mixed the starter with the water and the flour and the salt, and I began the rhythm that had defined my life. I didn't use the digital timers on the wall. I used my senses. I felt the temperature of the dough, and I listened to the sound of the mixer, and I watched the gluten develop until it was smooth and elastic, like a living muscle. For the next 6 hours, I was not an old woman who had been cast aside. I was a master of my craft. I laminated the butter into the croissant dough, creating the hundreds of layers that would shatter upon baking. I shaped the sourdough loaves with gentle hands, preserving the air pockets that the yeast had worked so hard to create. As the sun began to rise, the ovens were hot, and the first batch went in. The smell began to change. The chemical stench of the cleaning products was pushed out by the aroma of caramelizing sugars and roasting wheat. It was a smell that triggered memories of childhood and safety and home. At 7:30, the office door opened and Derek walked out. He stopped in his tracks and inhaled deeply, and his face transformed. The stress lines smoothed out and a look of pure greed replaced the anxiety. He walked over to the cooling rack where the loaves were singing their crackling song, and he reached out to touch one. He told me it was perfect. He said that he knew I could do it. He didn't thank me. He just looked at the bread and saw dollar signs. He told me that the investors were pulling into the parking lot and that I should probably leave out the back door because it wouldn't look good for the brand image if a grandmother was hanging around the kitchen. I untied my apron and folded it neatly. I picked up my bag, which now contained the jar of mother dough and the signed document. I looked at Derek one last time as he arranged my bread on a silver platter. I told him to enjoy his victory. I walked out the back door into the morning light, and I felt lighter than I had in years, because I knew that while the bread was rising, Derek's fall had just begun. I didn't go home after I walked out the back door of the bakery. Instead, I moved my car to a parking spot across the street near the dry cleaners, where I had a clear view of the front entrance of the Gilded Crumb. I sat there with the engine off and the windows rolled up, and I watched as a fleet of black luxury SUVs pulled up to the curb like a motorcade for a head of state. It was 8:15 in the morning, and the street was waking up with the rhythm of commuters and school buses. But inside that bakery, the future of my legacy was being decided by men who probably couldn't tell the difference between a croissant and a crescent roll. I watched as 4 men and 2 women in sharp business suits stepped out of the vehicles, and Derek rushed out to greet them with a smile that was so wide and eager it looked painful. He ushered them inside, and the heavy glass door swung shut, sealing them in with the aroma of the bread I had just baked. I sat there for an hour, and I passed the time by picking the dried dough from under my fingernails and listening to the rain start to fall again on the roof of the car. I imagined what was happening inside. I imagined them breaking open the sourdough and hearing the crust sing. I imagined them tasting the complex acidity of the crumb and nodding their heads in approval, thinking that this was what they could expect every day from a franchise chain. They were tasting a century of history and thinking they could photocopy it. Finally, the door opened again, and the group spilled out onto the sidewalk, and the body language had changed completely. When they arrived, they looked skeptical and serious. but now they looked relaxed and satisfied. One of the men was carrying a white paper bag stained with grease spots, which meant he was taking a croissant for the road. They shook Derek's hand vigorously, and I saw one of them clap him on the shoulder in that clubby way that men do when they have just made each other a lot of money. The SUVs drove away, and Derek stood on the sidewalk alone watching them go, and then he did something that made my stomach turn. He pumped his fist in the air and let out a shout of victory that I could hear even through the glass of my car window. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, and a moment later, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up and answered, and Derek didn't even say hello. He just shouted that they loved it. He was breathless and high on adrenaline, and he told me that the deal was practically done. He said they were blown away by the texture and the flavor profile, and that the lead investor had called it rustic perfection. I listened to him brag about how he had charmed them and how he had sold the vision of the brand. He barely mentioned the bread itself as if it were just a minor detail in his grand performance. I asked him quietly if he had told them about the mother dough, or if he had mentioned that the person who baked that bread was no longer employed by the company. Derek laughed, and it was a cruel, dismissive sound. He told me that details like that didn't matter. He said that now that he had the capital from the buyout, he could hire the best food scientists in the world to replicate the flavor. He said that with enough money, you can reverse engineer anything. He told me that my little magic trick with the yeast was cute, but ultimately unnecessary, because business is about scaling, and he had just scaled up. Then his voice dropped and became cold again. He told me that since the demonstration was a success, he wouldn't be needing me anymore. He said that our little arrangement was over, and that I should enjoy my retirement and stop loitering around the past. He told me not to come back to the bakery because the new owners would be bringing in their own team to transition the operations. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I watched him turn around and walk back into his stolen kingdom. He thought he had just won the lottery, but he didn't realize that he had just sold a promise he couldn't keep. He had sold them the taste of the mother dough, but he had kept the generic yeast. He had sold them my hands, but kept his own machines. I put the phone down and started my car. I looked at the signed document in my purse one last time. It was a lien on every piece of equipment in that building, including the ovens he was still paying off. Derek thought the deal was closed, but the real transaction was just beginning. I pulled out into traffic and drove toward the bank to deposit the check he had given me weeks ago and to file the document with the county clerk. I was in no rush. The bread was eaten, but the aftertaste would be bitter. The crash did not happen with a bang, but with the quiet, terrified whisper of a fax machine in a lawyer's office, followed by the ringing of telephones that nobody wanted to answer. It was 3 days after the presentation, and Derek was already spending the money he didn't have yet because I had seen him driving a brand new convertible around town with the top down despite the autumn chill. He was a man who believed that confidence was a currency, and he was spending it lavishly, but he forgot that in the world of high finance, confidence requires collateral. I was sitting in my small kitchen feeding the mother dough, which was bubbling happily in its jar, when my phone rang, and it was Marcus. His voice was low and urgent, and he told me that I needed to turn on the local business news immediately. I walked into the living room and turned on the television, and there was a reporter standing outside the Gilded Crumb. And the headline on the bottom of the screen read, "Bakery Deal Crumbles Under Fraud Allegations." Marcus filled in the details that the news camera couldn't see because he had been there that morning to deliver a final invoice before severing ties with the company. He told me that a team of auditors from Global Foods had arrived unannounced at 9 o'clock to conduct what they called a biological asset verification. They weren't interested in the books or the equipment. This time, they were interested in the intellectual property that justified the multi-million-dollar price tag. They wanted a sample of the proprietary 100-year-old yeast culture that Derek had boasted about in the prospectus. They had brought a food scientist with them, a woman with sharp eyes, and a portable lab kit, and she demanded to see the source of the flavor that had impressed the board of directors. Marcus said that Derek didn't even flinch because, in his arrogance, he still believed that all flour and water was the same. He had marched into the walk-in refrigerator and brought out the decoy jar that I had left behind weeks ago. It was the jar filled with the cheap supermarket yeast and dead flour that had been sitting there fermenting into a sour, useless sludge. He placed it on the counter with a flourish and told them to behold the magic. The scientist didn't look impressed. She opened the jar, and the smell that filled the room wasn't the sweet, complex aroma of apples and fermentation. It was the sharp, rotting smell of spoilage and stagnation. She took a small sample and placed it under a field microscope, and she tested the pH balance with a digital meter. The room was silent for a long time, while Derek shifted his weight from one foot to the other, smiling his plastic smile. Then the scientist looked up and dropped the hammer. She told him that this wasn't a century-old wild culture. She said it was a slurry of commercial Saccharomyces cerevisiae that was mostly dead due to neglect and improper feeding. She said it had zero biological value, and that it was genetically identical to the packets you buy for 50 cents at the convenience store. She asked him plainly how he had produced the bread for the tasting with this dead sludge. Derek stammered and turned red and tried to claim that the culture was just dormant or resting. But the scientist cut him off. She accused him of bait and switch. She said that the product they tasted 3 days ago could not have been made from this source, which meant that he had either sourced the bread from elsewhere or he was hiding the real asset. The lead auditor stepped forward then, and he wasn't smiling anymore. He told Derek that misrepresenting the assets of a company during a sale is not just a breach of contract, it is fraud. He told Derek that the deal was terminated effective immediately and that Global Foods would be filing a lawsuit to recover the costs of their due diligence. Marcus told me that he watched Derek crumble. The arrogance drained out of him like water from a cracked vase, leaving him looking small and terrified. He started screaming that it was a mistake and that he could fix it, but the auditors were already packing up their equipment. They walked out the door and took the future of the Gilded Crumb with them. I turned off the television and sat back in my chair, and I felt a deep, cold sense of justice. Derek had tried to sell a story that he didn't write, and he had tried to sell a legacy that he didn't earn. He thought the value was in the brand name and the shiny new ovens, but he failed to understand that the value was in the biology and the history. The phone rang again an hour later, and this time it was Derek. I didn't answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, and then I listened to the message. He was crying. He was babbling about lawsuits and investors pulling out, and he asked me where the real starter was. He asked me to bring it back. He said he would give me anything. I deleted the message and went back to the kitchen. I dipped a spoon into the jar of mother dough and tasted a tiny drop. It was sour and strong and alive. It was the taste of truth, and truth is something you cannot fake. The collapse of the Gilded Crumb was swift and brutal, because in the world of business bankruptcy acts like gravity, and once you lose your footing, the fall is inevitable. It had been 2 weeks since the auditors walked out, and the bakery was now dark and silent, with a handwritten sign taped to the glass door that read, "Closed until further notice," written in Derek's jagged, panic-stricken handwriting. I parked my car in the alley and met my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, who was a man of few words and sharp suits. We walked to the back entrance where the lock had already been changed by the landlord, but Mr. Henderson had the new keys, because when a ship sinks, the scavengers come looking for salvage, and we were the first ones at the wreck. We stepped inside, and the smell of the place had turned sour because the electricity had been cut, and the refrigerators had warmed up, leaving the smell of spoiled milk and rotting yeast to hang in the stagnant air. We found Derek sitting in the front office, and he looked like a ghost haunting his own ruins. He was sitting on the floor because the furniture had already been tagged for repossession, and he was surrounded by piles of threatening letters from the bank and the suppliers and the landlord. When he saw me, he didn't scream, and he didn't beg. He just looked up with hollow eyes and let out a dry laugh that sounded like sandpaper. He told me that I should take whatever I wanted because there was nothing left. He said the bank was coming at noon to seize the industrial ovens and the mixers and the espresso machines to auction them off to pay the debts. He said he was personally liable for the loans and that he was going to lose his condo and his car and his expensive watch. He looked at me and said that he hoped I was happy because I had burned down the house just to kill the spider. I didn't answer him immediately. I just motioned for Mr. Henderson to open his briefcase. My lawyer pulled out the original copy of the document that Derek had signed on the stainless steel table that night in his desperation to close the deal. He placed it on the desk next to the eviction notice. I told Derek that he really should have read the fine print before he signed it. I explained that the document was not just a biography or a vanity project. It was a binding acknowledgement of debt. By signing it, he had admitted that the value of the intellectual property I had provided to the business over 30 years was equal to the value of the physical assets currently in the building. I watched the confusion cloud his eyes as he tried to process what I was saying. I explained that the document granted me a first position lien on all machinery and equipment purchased by the company as collateral for that unpaid debt. In simple terms, it meant that while the bank might hold the mortgage on the business, I held the title to the tools. Derek snatched the paper up, and his eyes scanned the dense legal text that he had ignored in his arrogance. I saw his face turn pale as he read the clause on page 2, where he had explicitly pledged the new industrial ovens and the mixers to me as security. He dropped the paper as if it burned his fingers and looked at me with a mixture of horror and awe. He whispered that I couldn't do this. He said the bank would never allow it. Mr. Henderson stepped forward then and adjusted his glasses and told Derek that the lien had been filed with the county clerk the morning after the tasting. It was public record and it predated the bank's foreclosure proceedings. The equipment belonged to a Lara Vance. Just then, there was a heavy pounding on the front door, and we saw 2 men in coveralls standing there with dollies and tools ready to strip the place bare for the bank. Derek looked at them, and then back at me, and he realized that he was trapped. If the bank took the equipment, it would reduce his debt, but now they couldn't take it. He still owed the bank the full amount, but he had no assets to give them. I walked past him and into the kitchen. I ran my hand along the cold metal of the convection oven that Derek had bought to replace my hearth. It was a soulless machine, but it was an expensive one, and it was mine. I told the repo men through the glass that they could take the tables and the chairs and the espresso cups, but the heavy machinery was not to be touched. I turned back to Derek and saw a man who had been completely dismantled. He had tried to steal my past, and in doing so, he had signed away his future. He asked me what I was going to do with a bunch of industrial ovens that I hated. He asked me if I did this just to spite him. I looked at him and felt the weight of the last month lift off my shoulders. I told him that I didn't do it for spite. I did it for leverage. I told him that I didn't want the ovens, I wanted the value they represented. I told him that I was going to sell them and use the money to buy back the only thing that mattered. Derek put his head in his hands and wept, and the sound echoed in the empty bakery. I didn't feel triumph, and I didn't feel pity. I just felt the satisfaction of a ledger finally being balanced. I walked out of the office and left him to the silence he had created. The auction of the industrial equipment was a quick affair, because there is always a market for soulless efficiency, even if I had no use for it. I stood in the loading dock and watched as the massive convection ovens and the automated dough dividers were loaded onto flatbed trucks. I sold them to a commercial factory bakery in New Jersey for pennies on the dollar compared to what Derek had paid, but it was enough. The check I received was substantial enough to clear the immediate tax liens on the building and to make the bank a cash offer for the deed. Since Derek had defaulted on the mortgage and the building had been stripped of its value, by the scandal the bank considered it a toxic asset. They were desperate to get it off their books, so they sold it back to me for a fraction of its market value. It took 3 months of paperwork and dust, but by the time the first snow of winter began to fall, I held the keys to the Gilded Crumb once again. And this time, there was no trust fund and no stepson standing between me and my kitchen. The restoration was slow because I refused to rush. Marcus and I worked side by side scraping the white sterile paint off the walls to reveal the warm red brick underneath. We hired a local mason to rebuild the hearth oven using the original specifications, and although it wasn't the exact same oven, it had the same heart. We brought in bags of Marcus's premium organic flour, and we stacked the wood for the fire, and slowly the smell of the place began to shift from stale despair to the promise of warmth. We didn't have a grand opening with influencers and loud music. We simply unlocked the door one Tuesday morning and let the aroma of baking bread do the advertising. I had brought the mother dough back from my condo, and it seemed to sigh with relief as I poured it into the large ceramic mixing bowl. It knew it was home. The first batch of sourdough came out of the oven at 7 in the morning, and the crust sang that beautiful crackling song as it cooled. When Mrs. Gable walked in at 7:15, she didn't say a word. She just closed her eyes and inhaled, and a smile spread across her face that made her look 10 years younger. She bought 2 loaves and told me that the city had felt empty without me. By noon, the line was out the door again, but this time it moved slowly because we took the time to talk to people. Marcus was working the counter, charming the customers with his knowledge of grain, while I stayed in the back covered in flour doing the work I was born to do. We were making less money than Derek's projection charts had promised, but we were making a profit, and more importantly, we were making friends. A few weeks later, I found myself driving through the commercial district on the other side of town to pick up some specialty vanilla beans, and I decided to stop for a coffee. I pulled into the drive-thru of a large fast food chain, the kind of place where everything is frozen and the efficiency is measured in seconds. I spoke my order into the speaker and pulled my car around to the payment window. The window slid open, and I found myself looking into a face that I knew well. Derek was wearing a polyester uniform with a name tag that said, "Manager," and he was wearing a headset just like he used to. But now, instead of closing million-dollar deals, he was listening to complaints about cold French fries. He looked older. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dull resignation. He froze when he saw me. His hand hovered over the cash register, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see the shame burning in his cheeks. He looked at the luxury car I was driving, and then down at his grease-stained uniform. I handed him my credit card, and he took it with a trembling hand. He processed the payment and handed me my coffee, and his eyes met mine for a brief second. There was no anger there anymore, just a question. He seemed to be asking how it had all gone so wrong. I took the coffee and looked at him with a calm detachment. I told him to keep the change. I didn't say it with malice, I said it because I knew he needed it. I drove away, and I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. Derek had wanted a business that ran on systems and efficiency without the messiness of human touch, and he had found it. He was exactly where he belonged. I returned to the bakery as the sun was setting. The last customers were leaving, and the display cases were empty, save for a few crumbs. Marcus was sweeping the floor, and he looked up and smiled as I walked in. I went to the back and fed the mother dough, covering it with the linen cloth to rest for the night. The air was warm and sweet and silent. I was tired, my bones ached, and my hands were stiff, but I had never felt more alive. I had reclaimed my legacy not with a lawyer or a contract, but with flower water and patience. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that family should always be forgiven? Or are some betrayals simply too expensive to pay for? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.